there will be something new. And in the past, when I've spoken about the Pottery Army, I followed my instincts, or perhaps it's more habit as a historian. And starting from the Shang Dynasty, 1500 BC, going all the way down, I trace the development of the state through social, political, military developments, as well as that of the material culture that leads to the Qin Dynasty and the First Empire. And all of this, of course, is relevant in gaining an understanding of what you're seeing when you're standing in front of these figures. But I wonder if one could cram a whole semester's worth of material into 1 hour or less. And wouldn't it be better to spend time to focus on the circumstances of the creators of this spectacular army and its setting, and to talk about what we were actually seeing. Now, it's been 35 years since I first visited the site, and as I think about it, there are two aspects that seem to me to be especially striking. First of all, the situation of the time during which this pottery army was produced, and secondly, the creativity, the inherent ingenuity that these figures demonstrate. It's really remarkable. Now, the early years of Zhao Zheng, the future first emperor of the Qin, can remind one of a TV series, Dallas or Soap. I'm not sure what the current soaps are, but anyway. His mother had been a concubine of a man named Lu Buwei, and Lu Buwei held an office in the state of Zhao, which was, I can't see from there, but anyway, and it was nearby to the state of Qin, and a prince of the Qin was held as a kind of a hostage in the state of Zhao, and Lu Buwei presented the prince with his concubine. Now, when the prince returned to Qin to become its king, he took her back with him, and in 259 BC, Zheng was born. There's a possibility, or so the gossip had it, that the actual father was Lu Buwei, not the prince. But at any rate, the king of Qin died in 246 BC, and Zheng, at the age of 13, ascended the throne. Now, as he was a minor, he was assisted by a group of able ministers, generals. The chief minister was that same Lu Buwei who had come over to the Qin, and who now served there. He held a fief of 100,000 families and a noble title of marquis, and so on. But perhaps to ensure his position, things weren't that settled. He arranged that an underling of his, named Lao Ai, became the lover of his erstwhile concubine, who was now the queen mother. And I'm going to spare you the details, but they're quite good. You can do that on your own. This cozy arrangement was disrupted when the young ruler came of age in 238 BC. He acted decisively. He was then 21, and he acted decisively. Okay. With these hearing aids, the doctor told me that I hear my voice internally, and I don't speak as loudly as I would without hearing aids. I don't know if any of you have that problem. So if you don't hear me, raise your hand or stamp your foot or something, so we can communicate. So at any rate, the young king took took everything into his own hands, the reins of power, and continued Qin's very aggressive wars against the other states in China. Got to figure this out. Now, Zheng had come to the throne at the end of a period that's called that of the Warring States. It was the culmination of a process going back centuries, during which there had been over 100 states. Some of them were just statelets, small. We might say they had been reduced in numbers to just 7, and those are on this map. It seems to have different colors than what I had originally intended. But anyway, there were 7 states when he came, and these 7, which of course included Qin, were locked in warfare. Now, Qin Qin is this one over, is over here. This is the Qin. So it's way in the southwest in a sense, you know. And so they were locked in warfare, and so that's why the name Warring States is a very appropriate title for that period. Each was seeking to defend itself and to bring down their opponents. In that contest, Qin emerged as the most powerful and the most successful of its time, and its strength had its roots in developments going back centuries. Located on the frontier of the Chinese heartland, the wars with tribal neighbors honed its military skills, but also earned the Qin a reputation for being less civilized than the other Chinese states. There was a series of reforms in Qin that gradually developed an infrastructure that led to better utilization of its resources, both human and material. Now we have a witness, a very interesting witness to the Qin state of that time, because Shunzi is one of the most famous Confucians. He's sort of, he comes after Confucius. He's about third or fourth generation from Confucius, but he's one of the most eminent Confucians, and he's almost contemporary with the period he's talking about. He died in 238 BC, and he says, quote, "As for the rulers of Shunzi, by the way, is X-U-N-Z-I, in case you want to look it up, X-U-N-Z-I. Now, as for the rulers of Qin, they have only a narrow, confined area on which to settle their people. They employ them harshly, they terrorize them with authority, embitter them with hardships, coax them with rewards, and cow them with punishments. They see to it that if the humbler people hope to gain any benefits from the superiors, they can do so only by achieving distinction in battle." They're completely battle-oriented. They oppress the people before employing them, and they make them win some distinctions before granting them benefit. Rewards increase to keep pace with achievements. So if a man who returns from battle with 5 enemy heads, they don't took scalps in those days, they took heads, with 5 enemy heads is made the master of 5 families in his neighborhood. So that was the way to be promoted. This is the best method to ensure a strong and populous state that will last for a long time. A wide expanse of territory that yields taxes, therefore, yields taxes. Therefore, Qin's repeated victories during the last 4 generations are no accident, but the result of policy, close quote. So that's incredible to have such a contemporary assessment of the state of Qin. Now, these measures encouraged a productive agricultural basis, an effective military arm, while reducing the powers of traditional aristocracy. And at the same time, a detailed law code regulated all activities, and an institution of group responsibility ensured a tight control of the population. It was a really kind of dictator state, let's say. There was a system of calibrated rewards and punishments as incentives for meritorious conduct. But life under what is called that legalist regime was oppressive and burdensome. Now we've long known from literary sources something of the legalism, the philosophy which supplied the theoretical foundations of that legal and social institutions of the state. How the aim was to produce a perfect mechanism. You can think of sort of a clockwork with the system of rewards and punishments calibrated to such a fine detail that the system would, they thought, endure forever. Now, recently, there was a coffin unearthed of a minor official of that time, and in his coffin were found 1,000 bamboo strips. In those days, they didn't have paper yet. And they wrote on slips of paper, especially bamboo. And, you know, if you look at a Chinese book today in the Chinese style, I don't know if any of you have seen them, the characters are written in strips with lines between. Those are emulating the bamboo strips. Even down today, that tradition, you know, it's interesting that the past influences the present. Anyway, they found over 1,000 bamboo strips, and among which are a large number of bearing on the law code. Some of them are in the form of a case book to provide precedents for the magistrates. And the codes cover every wrongdoing imaginable. And these materials allow us to understand why it was said that the streets of the capital were awash in red tunics, because the convicts who had been convicted of crimes didn't wear, striped uniforms like we do here, but they wore red. And they were the slaves of the state. The laws were applied strictly, and life in Qin was a harsh and a bleak one. Okay, under the young king, the pace of the military effort to unify China and the bitterness of the struggle intensified. Now, before the final victory, the other states were thrown into a panic by the continuing success of the Qin armies. And the state of Dien, which is up here way at the end of the northeast, resorted to assassination to stop this onslaught. The plot was complicated. There was a general who had fled from Qin, where he was about to be executed, to seek refuge in Yen. And he offered his head, on which there was a reward, as bait. And a brave swordsman named Jin Ke took the head in a box and a map of Yen's defenses to seek an audience with the King of Qin. The head and the map were to gain him admittance inside the throne room. Now, once in the audience hall, Jin Ke drew a knife out of the rolled up map and lunged at the king. That's what we see is going on here. And this is an incident in a Han relief about 100 years after the event. Then this is a... Okay, and here's a modern artist version. Jin Ke missed. They dodged around a pillar. The knife stuck in the pillar. Finally, the king was able to draw his sword, and Jin Ke was killed. And the story is a famous one in China. We don't have a portrait. We don't have a portrait of the king. This is by a modern artist, based on his own imagination. But there is a contemporary description of the king, and no doubt it was biased. Quote, "The King of Qin," you notice he's still called the king at this point. He's not yet the emperor. "The King of Qin has a waspish nose, eyes like slits, a chicken breast, and a voice of a jackal. He is merciless with the heart of a tiger or a wolf. When in difficulties, he willingly humbles himself. When successful, he swallows men up without a scruple." Close quote. So Qin was ultimately successful because it was the most radical in instituting the new changes. So in 221 BC, the 26th year of his reign, the issue was settled, and Qin emerged triumphant, and China was united. Now, it's clear from the text that the king saw it as his task to extend to all of China the same system as that which existed in his own state, to create an empire and to mold the country as he willed. And in this, he was so successful that he set the pattern which China followed for the next 2,000 years. And our name China probably comes from the name of his dynasty, Qin. The weights and the measures, which had been differentiated among all these other states, were all standardized. The coins, they didn't use paper money then, they used bronze and some gold, were all standardized. The round Chinese coin with the square hole, that was the Qin coin that then became the standard for all of China. The writing script was made uniform. And the country was divided into 36 prefectures, which we see here, each governed by a person that he himself appointed. The Great Wall was built. The bronze weapons in the country were confiscated and melted down into 12 huge colossal statues over 20 feet high. Unfortunately, it doesn't survive. These were placed in front of the new palaces which he built. He built over 200 new palaces. And these were connected by covered passageways so that no one could know where he slept. And so that would confound any would-be assassin who tried again. All the old books except for practical ones. And the practical ones they thought were on medicine, divination, and agriculture. These other books were considered to be subversive and to cause confusion among the people, and so they were burned. This is a picture that, of course, is much later. This is something like 18th century, and we can see books in a style that were not in vogue in the Qin dynasty, but became standard later, being burned, and the eminent scholars were tossed into a pit to be buried alive. This is one of the crimes that's associated with the Qin dynasty. So this is not a pleasant period you should look at. But your students should come in with a little bit of trepidation when they see these things. So soon after unification, finally China was united, and he said, quote, "Insignificant as I am, I have raised troops to punish the rebellious princes, and thanks to the sacred powers of our ancestors, all 6 kings have been chastised as they deserved, so that at last the empire is pacified. Now, unless we create a new title, how can we record our achievements for posterity? So discuss this question and come up with a more appropriate imperial title," close quote. But it's characteristic of him that he rejected all the suggestions by his ministers and decided on his own to be called Huangdi, sovereign emperor or theocrat, if you will. Now, Di in the Huangdi was the name of the deities and of the royal ancestors. That was the tradition from the Shammona, and it later came to be used again as a posthumous title for rulers. But Qin Shi Huangdi, Shi means the first, Huangdi of the Qin dynasty, so he's called Qin Shi Huangdi, decided to award himself his own posthumous name. I mean, what nerve, huh? Now, it's his energy and his sense of supreme power which strikes one in reading his annals, you know. I should have had that picture up. that's the man we're talking about, okay? So new roads were built to connect all the parts of the realm, and royal processions. There's a model of this. It's an accurate in-scale model of what has been found at his mausoleum. So he would have traveled in such a vehicle only full size, and you can see it's just incredible. It's made of bronze. Everything is made of bronze here, except for gold and silver parts. And the tassels under the horse's jaws. They didn't know until they found this that they knew how to draw bronze into threads. You know, the sides of the cabin were covered with brocade, and the brocade is simulated in bronze, so that we can see exactly how it would have been with cloth. So this is incredibly. Now, of course, what we've got is a model or something. Right. It's not what they actually found, but you can just imagine from seeing it how incredibly proficient they were at this time. And the royal processions were made to distant corners of the empire, both to show the flag to his newly conquered people, but also to aid his search for the secret of immortality. And much treasure was expended in the effort to secure the proper drugs. One of the drugs, of course, is uric oxide, cinnabar. I've met people in Taiwan who still take a pill, a cinnabar, to gain, length of life. Evidently, well, anyway, on one of these journeys, a storm kept him from crossing the Yangtze, and he asked who's in control of this area, which god, and they said there's a goddess who has a temple up on that hill. So he had the trees on the mountain where her temple stood cut down, and the mountain was painted red, the color of the convicts. So it seems then only poetic justice that Qin Shi Huang's hubris, his wanton insolence deriving from excessive pride, finally resulted in an ignominious end. In 210 BC, Qin Shi Huangdi died on one of his tours. Can you see there's a dotted line on one of please?
Yeah.
That's where he died, and then the rest of the journey, he was in one of those vehicles that we just saw to take him back to the capital. His close advisors concealed his death because they were plotting to place a prince of their own choice on the throne. They wanted someone who was manipulative. And on the way home, a cartload of salted fish kept pace near his carriage in order to conceal the smell of his decaying body. So that's the way he ends up. Now, when the cortege reached the capital, the funeral could take place at once, because Qin Shi Huangdi had begun work on his tomb when he ascended the throne 36 years before. That is, all the while he's seeking for drugs of immortality, he had continued to prepare for his death. He evidently believed in hedging his bets. Now, from the description in his annals, in the history, this is from the Shiji, we know that a deep pit was dug. It was lined with bronze. The tomb was then filled with models. This is from the Life magazine. This is not an archaeologist's view, okay? But it's based on this description that dates from his time. And so models of palaces, fine vessels, rarities. The rivers were reproduced in mercury, you can see there. And the mercury had mechanisms so that the mercury seemed to flow. And the heavens above were painted on the ceilings. Crossbows were set as traps against the inevitable grave robbers. The ladies of the harem who had not born sons were buried inside, as were some teams of workmen, so that they couldn't reveal the secrets of its entrance. And then grass and trees were planted over the funeral mound to make it seem like a natural hill. Now the mound itself is about 140 feet high and about 1,200 feet along each side. It's about half of what it was originally. You can't do it. This is years ago when you could climb to the top, which I did several times. It looked frantically for any kind of artifact. One of my students, now retiring, but when some local farmer gave him a piece of a tile of the Qin dynasty. So I've been very envious of that for years and years. But in all likelihood, there's little left in the tomb of any value. When the dynasty ended a few years after the emperor's death, the invading armies are said to have plundered the palaces and tombs of Qin. There's a story in the Hanshu, the history of the dynasty that followed the Qin, that paints a dismal picture of the site. It says that a shepherd lad who had a flock of sheep, and one of his sheep had wandered into the tomb, so there was some kind of an opening at that time, and he followed in looking for the sheep. He had a torch, and he accidentally dropped the torch, and it set fire to the sarcophagus. That's a story. And another thing that I noticed, no one else seems to have pointed out, in the 4th century, that's 600 years later, there was a ruler of the area who is said to have looted the tomb to obtain the bronze. Remember, the tomb was lined with bronze. He wanted to make weapons, and you could use bronze, of course, to make weapons. So it may be that not much of the original treasure remains, but modern archaeologists have made a thorough exploration of the surface of the mountain. By the way, they found mercuric compounds on the top of the hill, which substantiates the idea that there was mercury in the tomb, which has somehow come to the surface, But this is what they find underground based on the modern techniques, and they claim that there's no evidence of a robber's tunnel. So perhaps there are still treasures contained in the tomb, but they say that they don't intend to excavate the tomb until they've developed techniques that will allow them to preserve whatever is still in there. Because once you enter the tomb and oxygen comes in, then it begins to deteriorate. And so they want to make sure that they can instantly conserve whatever is in the tomb. In this area, my last visit, there was a Han Dynasty tomb that they had found. it's near Xi'an. Anyway, there's a Han Dynasty tomb, and they found murals in it, and they immediately filled it with inert gas and sealed it, so that in time, when they figure out how to preserve the colors so that they don't deteriorate, they'll go back to that tomb. So that's the kind of care that's taken with trying to conserve the record of the past. Now, we need to remember that the mound is but a small part of the mausoleum as a whole. So here you have the mound. There are two walls around it, and all around are various pits. They found something like 180 pits. They haven't excavated them all, but they've located them, and all sorts of things come up from those. And in this area here, these were tombs of close associates of the emperor. But this was the city that was built to serve the spirit of the emperor. This is half. I couldn't get the whole thing on one slide. This is half of. These are the foundations of the buildings that went up and up and up. That served that housed the enormous staff that served the spirit of the deceased emperor. Every day food was laid out, clothing was laid out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in these various pits that we talked about, they have found, for example, like this is the pit where they found the chariot and the vehicle that the model that we see outside. And you can see the excavators here. I write this out so I don't digress, but sometimes I will, okay? I remember years ago, it was obvious that that these things were half-scale, half-scale models. But there was a Chinese journal published in Beijing that in English it said it was life-sized. So the editor of that journal, a Canadian who had taken on Chinese citizenship, came to Stanford to give a talk. And so after the talk, I came up to him and I asked him, what was the Chinese that you translated as life-sized? Now, he's about this tall. So he said it depends who you're comparing with. Anyway, so you found vehicles, you found like this is the chariot that was in the same pit, the other vehicle, the cart that we saw. And you found civil officials who, this is the office that was in charge of these trips that he made. And if this is in the exhibit, I haven't seen this exhibit yet, they keep changing what is shown. But if it is the same, then look at the side and you'll see a little knife and a pouch. And that's because when they made a mistake on the bamboo, they used a knife to erase the character right over, So the civilian officials have that. So he's standing at attention. And then you had entertainers, like this. They say these are acrobats. It may be, there's some dispute about this, what this is about. It may be a kind of a gymnasium rather than an acrobat. We don't know. So this is another one. And then there's a place where they have, it's a simulation of a brook with some waterfowl. And so this is a goose. There's also a crane with a fish in his mouth, all made with bronze. And the feathers are simulated in that, and they must have one of those fowl here that you can see. And then along the bank of the river, they had musicians like this one sitting, whole rows of them, sitting to play music. So this is just a kind of a sampling of the kinds of things that they're finding. Now, much still remains to be uncovered, of course. But what was so unexpected and so overwhelming in scope is the army of life-size pottery figures, of an army of over 7,000 men. Now, this is the estimate. They've only really dug about a third of it so far. But they have test pits that sort of confirm what their conclusions are. So it's about 7,000, plus 96 chariots, 116 cavalrymen, which had, which were being uncovered. And these are in 3 pits. Here's the mound, and then these are the pits, and it's about 3/4 of a mile away. In fact, when they first uncovered, they didn't associate it with the mound because the mound was so far away. And the story of how that came to be is an interesting one, which I will not digress on unless there's questions we can talk about it. But at any rate, the first pit. The first pit is the largest by far. It's 700 feet. That's 2 football fields in length and about 200 and I forgot now, 250 was it? Feet wide, 200 feet wide, and it's made up of 11 corridors, all told here. They run the whole length. You have 9 internal corridors, and then a kind of a corridor around all 4 sides, and ramps that enter from the eastern end. Now, the corridors, this is just, a part of it. So you can see these are the internal corridors, and then you've got these. And the soldiers all face to the east, except those on the side. They would face to the outside to prevent some kind of surprise attack, The corridors are separated by walls of 5 to 7 feet thick of rammed earth, and then the floors are tiled. The first use of tile that we know, and they're kind of curved so that any water that leaked in would then run off, and so on. And then you had these pillars of wood separated by 4 to 5 feet apart. Then you had rafters across, and then you had various layers on top, mats and plaster, and finally then the earth that had been excavated, and you had something like 6 to 9 feet high, and that would have been above the ground level. So there are no tiles found here, so it must have been just the mound, no buildings on top. And the collapse of the supports caused the mound to fall in and cover the contents of the pit, concealing it until today, when it was discovered by some farmers in the area digging a well. The other 2 pits, smaller in size, are similar in construction, and then there was a 4th pit that was unfinished at the time. Now, I had seen reports of these pottery warriors before I went to Xi'an the first time in 1977. And I had even translated some of these reports which were published. So I was prepared to meet them in person, as it were. And I was, of course, impressed. And at that time, the first pit had been published. The second and third had not yet been published. There really was nothing like them before in China. Figurines, you had things like this that had been placed in these homes. These are just, 5, 6 inches tall. Art historians don't like to say crude or stuff like that because we're imposing our aesthetics on something of the past. But I think they're crude and very unrealistic in a sense. They were made of wood, jade, pottery. And after the Qin, it's centuries before you find life-size realistic statues again being made. So the Qin, this is one of the great conundrums, startling, whatever you call it, that somehow, out of nothing, you had these sculptures made. Just incredible. So, as I turned the corner of the museum that we had been brought to, and I saw this kneeling bowman. Now this is from Pit 2, and as I say, Pit 2 had not yet been published, so it was new. I had been expecting the figures to all be this kind of standing at attention, looking to the front. But what you see here is so startling that the archaeologists that were accompanying us thought I was going to have a heart attack. And they led me to a chair to sort of calm down. But here was a figure that did more than stand straight, staring ahead, as amazing as that was in degree of realism. The bowman's body was bent and twisted, his head looked up. It had taken the Greeks centuries to arrive at this level of skill. If anyone here specializes in Greek archaeology, tell me later where my mistakes are. My impression is that you have early figures like this, which can sort of be related to what we just saw. Then you have the Kuroi figures like this, and they advance to that, and then finally you get something like that. This took centuries, this took 2, maybe more centuries. But here in China, it apparently emerged fully formed, without any process of development, without intermediate stages that mark progress in realistically depicting the human body. So I find that incredible. Now, the details and realism of these figures is, as they say, truly amazing. It has been said, perhaps with some justification, that a new society, a sharp break with the past, brought forth this new realism. In China, it's put a bit differently. It's said to be the art of the new landowning class, which replaced the feudal slave-owning class. But whether we accept these analyses or not, clearly nothing like it had existed before, nor for centuries afterwards. Now, if we look at how they were made, the legs are pretty solid. The torsos were built up by a coil technique as if they were making an urn, large-sized urn. Solid hands on hollow arms were then attached, and the head was inserted through the neck. The rough core then had a finer clay layer added, and the details were then added individually, like we see here. The finest points of hairdress, of fingernails, even the tread on the soles of boots, like that kneeling bowman that we just saw. What you have here are knots, and I assume that these are made like buxia are made today in China. That is, in Dunhuang, I saw a woman sewing, and what it is the thread goes in and out of layers of cloth to make the sole of the shoe, and so they're still being made. There's a wide variety of facial types. There's such diversity, in fact, that when they first started reporting these, people thought that they were portraits. It's hard to think that they're going to line up 7,000 soldiers and start making portraits of them. But an archaeologist at the site told me that they make out about 100 individual faces. That is, there were about 100 molds that were used for the heads, and then they were individualized. Then the whole was then baked to form a hard earthenware, gray in color. Now some of them have a reddish portion, sometimes they're entirely red. That comes from after the pit was set on fire by the invaders. Some of the statues were exposed to a higher temperature, and so they became red in color. But the color that they produced, the temperature was low enough to produce only a gray earthenware. Okay? And then they were painted. This is a model that they have there. They were painted in a wide variety of colors with mineral-based paints. And what they did is I remember one time when I was there, the guide that was with our party was talking to the head archaeologist and was urging him, first of all, to dig it all up right away and to paint them all the original colors. That really enhanced the tourist trade. And he just shrugged his shoulders, But to sort of go halfway, what they did was to take some of the statues and paint them with the original color. Now, for years I thought there's nothing in the literature that said differently, that they knew what the colors were because there were some pieces of color in the cracks on the, and so on, and so on. But recently, there's been articles. What they're doing now is the institute, their research institute, and with some German research institutes, they're working to preserve the colors. It turns out that the colors are actually surviving, but once the piece is exposed to air, within 5 minutes, the color flakes off. So what they're doing is immediately taking it into a compression chamber, sort of, with high humidity to maintain what it was like underground. And then they're using various chemicals to try to maintain, to conserve the colors, But meanwhile, as I said, in order to meet the tourist trade, what they did was to set up some of these. Somehow the color is not right. They're much more garish than you see here. I don't know what's going on. But at any rate, they were too garish. And the tourists, instead of embracing them, laughed so much that they took them away. So you don't see this anymore. As I say, the results were certainly spectacular. But it's something like if we went to a gallery to see some Greek sculpture, which was originally painted, I don't think we would accept it right away. We'd like the marble, the original marble, rather than the color that's applied. So it's a matter of aesthetics. And this is the general, and this is my son Joseph. So you don't see that. You don't see that color now. It's been added. Sorry, these are bright reds and bright yellows and bright oranges and so on. Somehow I don't know what's going on, but anyway, it allows us to. It allows us to see more clearly the construction of the armor, and the armor probably represents lacquered leather. That is, they would make scales of. Scales is really the wrong word. It's more lamellae is one term that can be used, or plates that are made of leather and then covered with lacquer. And the lacquer of the armor is usually black for the soldiers. And then what they do is they bind it up with cords that go through the holes on all four sides of each plate. They overlap from top down. And what you see here are the knots that of the cord coming in and out, of paired holes. On the bottom, the imbrication is the opposite way. The lower overlays the upper one, and that's because when the body bends, that's more suitable. And also here, when you raise the arm, if it was the other imbrication, you'd be pushing against the scale, but this way it's easier. And so what we see is that the way the thongs are on the inside here, you see them on the outside down here. Okay, at any rate, some of the students might be interested in the details of armor, so that's why I'm going into that. And there's special armor for the officers. They have smaller plates, and light armor for cavalrymen who had to get up and keep their balance on horses because they didn't have stirrups yet. Stirrups aren't invented in China until the 4th century AD. And the heaviest armor is for the chariot drivers, who even have the fingers of their hands protected in case an arrow hits. They don't lose control of the chariot. Now, none of the soldiers wear helmets, though we know that they existed at the time. What you see rather are a number of these figures with caps on their head, which may be a kind of a helmet liner. But there was a pit that they found near the mound, part of the mausoleum, of thousands of suits of stone armor. That is, instead of being made of lacquered leather, they made them of limestone. And why? Who knows? It's too heavy to really wear. It may be, in a sense, a statement of protection against evil spirits coming in who could be met with this kind of stone armor. I don't know. Anyway, they put together about 83 suits of that stone armor, exactly modeled like that of the one that was actually used. But here you have helmets, and that was the way the helmets looked at the time. So we have preserved for us an example of that splendid military instrument that enabled the Qin to conquer China. We see here the army of the Qin described in almost contemporaneous accounts as consisting of 1 million men wearing armor, 1,000 chariots, and 10,000 cavalry. We don't find an army of that size here. It's only 7,000, but there may be more. If you ask archaeologists, have you found more pits like this? They sort of smile. So we don't know. But we've dealt with such questions as who, where, and what. Now we have to turn to why. Why were these pits built? What purpose did the military arrays serve? And here we have to speculate. For curiously, with all the writing that we have of this period, there's nothing which deals with life beyond the grave. There are no texts equivalent to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which explains to us the nature of the spirit or its fate. So we have to speculate. Now, the modern scholar Stephen Popenkamp has observed that there seems to have been several conflicting and confused notions of the fate of the dead, with little discussion of the subject. And only after the arrival of Buddhism, there appeared detailed, cosmological, and precise descriptions of rebirth and the afterlife and so on. So Popenkamp continues, quote, we have relative silence on the subject of the dead before 200 AD and garrulousness afterwards, close quote. But there is a great deal of information in the earlier period provided by archaeological explorations of the elaborate burials. And it's clear from the grave goods and the constructions of the tombs, in the view of a really eminent scholar of Taoism and folk religion, Anna Seidel, who passed away too young. She says that the tomb was a permanent home of the dead. The soul, or the Hun, H-U-N, the Hun, could travel, but basically the tomb was its home base. Perhaps we can go further. Liu Yang, who curated this exhibit, he's the curator in the University of Minneapolis. Right? Minneapolis, I think so. In the catalog for the exhibit, says that the Chinchulangdi's objective in going to such lengths to create a facsimile of the real world in the afterlife was motivated by his eagerness for immortality. The tomb was to be, quote, an elaborate subterranean palace, a parallel world that would extend his rule into the afterlife, close quote. Another scholar in that catalog, Jieguo, remarks acutely that the conceptualization of the supernatural world is determined by the social world which is actually lived. Further, that the tomb is foremost a supply center with the necessities required for that afterlife. Finally, she adds that any attempt to impose a single theory to explain the true nature of the complex would distort the views held at the time about death and the afterlife. But that still allows us to explore some of what may have been in the mind of Chinchulangdi in undertaking the creation of this incredible monument. Now, first of all, the placement of the pottery figure is significant. So here you have the pit with the soldiers all facing east, and here you have the pass through which the enemy came in 206 that ended the dynasty. So they're facing the direction that they would expect the enemy to come. But could anyone have believed that these earthenware figures, as impressive and as fearsome as they were, could really defend the homeland against actual enemies? Probably people of the time were not that credulous, and the display, I think, had other purposes. We know that it was necessary to protect the grave from evil spirits. Texts speak of shamans sent to exorcise the tomb. And in later times, this is from about 3rd century AD, some armed and ferocious figurines such as this were placed for that purpose in the grave. But the size of this army here, if it was meant for that purpose, I think represented overkill on a stupendous scale. Rather, I think the army was related to a display of status. It was to establish the credentials of the inhabitant of the tomb as a man of supreme importance. We find in this tomb and in later periods as well an attempt to recreate through models or actual objects the world of the deceased as he enjoyed it in life. And in such tombs, around the coffin, by paintings, by objects, some real and some only models, were represented the paraphernalia of home and official position. So there was created or recreated the world of the living for the ruler of all of China here. It was fitting that the heaven above and the earth below with its rivers and mercury be reproduced. An army of that size was then appropriate for such trappings would allow the spirit of Qin to occupy his proper station in the other world. We know that offerings were made to the spirits of the dead in the hope that those spirits would bring good fortune to the survivors. The spirits might themselves not be able to render such assistance, but they could intercede with the more powerful gods on behalf of their descendants. The spirit of an emperor, especially that of the founder of a dynasty, was at the side of Shangdi, the supreme deity, where his duty was to look after the fortunes of the ruling house and the welfare of the state. Now, obviously, such a position required the trappings of an emperor, and hence these needed to be provided in the tomb. Without such equipment, it wouldn't be possible to take up one's position in the other world, which in many ways was seen as a perfect image of this one. So Qin Shi Huangdi thus prepared himself for eternity. For just as he served the interests of his descendants, their continuity and their sacrifices to him perpetuated his spirit at the court of Shangdi. In some ways, the power and energy of that rule brought forth a realism which was a break from the past. And we have a unique monument, the product of absolute rule, of absolute power. Never again until modern times do we have that sense of the ability to reshape society, to create a new world. Nor was there again to be seen a mausoleum of such grandeur, of such scope. But yet we know it failed. It failed in its purpose. For rather than obtaining for him the niche next to Shangdi, where he might have ensured the good fortune of his descendants for all time, his name was Shi the First, and he said that his dynasty would last till 10,000 rulers. His empire collapsed a scant 4 years after his death. For us, it evokes the sadness of the past grandeur and the vain hopes for immortality. I think as we look at these figures that we should look at them as depicting real human beings. The officers, taller and plumper, seem to me to be a bit more self-satisfied. Like this guy. But they made it. But the faces of the common soldiers look rather sad and devoid of much hope. Any who managed to survive faced a bleak future in that legalist-driven society. Then it happened that the leader of a work crew who was facing execution because of a heavy rainfall and had delayed his schedule was the first to rebel. And in the faces of these soldiers, we can imagine, perhaps, why that spark of resistance turned into a fire that soon raced over the whole of the Qin Empire and brought it down. So when you look at these figures, think about all that. Thank you.